and then I will begin to share my screen. So welcome back, everyone, for another session, our Wednesday evening Shanghai time session. Just sharing some information about teaching online. I'm really trying to offer ideas that I think could be useful to you in August here, 2020, so that you can incorporate them as you either plan for your upcoming semester, or maybe you're going to start the semester very soon. But I am going to try to talk and make sure that they're integrated in case you are going to run mixed mode, or you want to do some online, or you're going to be face-to-face. One of the biggest questions that I'm receiving these days is how can we best prepare for the unknown, right? So we've been through last semester where a lot of us around the world had to quickly move our courses online or in some sort of a different format. And for the most part, the data that I've collected, the colleagues that I've worked with, and just a lot of the readings that I've been doing, as teachers, as instructors, we did a great job. I think even as students, they did a great job. You know, everything is conditional and contextual, so they did a great job at what was happening at the time and the moment. I do think that the savvy instructors were really thinking about, even in May, what the future might bring, and trying to plan and prepare. So these kind of sessions, I'm really hoping to add to that, both individually and as a group. And I'm sure you're talking amongst each other here on this, people that are working on this session, as well as your colleagues at your institutions. And so this is one of those times in life where we've got to take information from a lot of different places, make sense of it fairly quickly. At the same time, I think we need to really find a focus, because this can all be overwhelming. There can be lots of information coming in from everywhere. And so the challenge is going to be trying to identify the information that we can use now to improve our courses now, and then slowly throughout the semester, maybe try to increase some of the complexities and add some things. So with that in mind, this was one of the topics that was pretty high up on the list of the needs survey that you may recall went out about a month or so ago. And it could be more theoretical. I'm going to try to make it as applicable and pragmatic as possible. But the concept of teaching as research. And I want to make one kind of final point before I jump right into this, is that this is something that I'm hoping people are doing now, whether they know it or not, whether they formalize it or not. But we all probably ask ourselves this question, did what I do work, and how do I know that it worked? So let's go ahead and talk about, hopefully after the next 50 minutes or so, we'll be able to do some of these things, right? We'll be able to define some of the attributes of TaR. I'll use this acronym now, Teaching as Research, TaR. You'll be able to kind of think about some of the types and the attributes. Maybe you'll start to think about how that might align with your teaching, your planning, your first day, the middle of the day, the end of the semester. I'd like to give you kind of an advanced organizer to start to think about some topics that might be of interest to you. And I'll share with you what that means a little more specifically very soon. That'll be one time when we may want to use the chat box and share some of those ideas. And the last thing I would like for you to consider, how you might collect some data. And sometimes this sounds a bit scary, collecting data and how formal it is. I actually probably would predict that you already collect some data. You may not know that you're collecting data, or you may not be thinking about it in that way. But the point of collecting this data is to answer some essential questions that we might have on our teaching. So let's go ahead and start the big question, right? I think we all teach, and we have completed, or we're in a graduate program, and so we're asking some pretty complex questions about teaching and how we might be good at this. I try to not use the word good. That's a fairly subjective word, and so typically we use the term effective, because effective can be measured, it can be consistent, reliable, valid. And so my question to myself, and I'll pose it to you, and you might think about this, is like, when is our teaching effective? When do we know it's effective? How do we know it's effective? And I give some ideas there that sometimes these are some responses that I get from my colleagues. It could be student reactions. When we're teaching face-to-face, or even online, sometimes we can see their videos and we see students smiling, or maybe having a confused look. They might raise their hands a lot, or they might not raise their hands at all. These are data points. These are kind of qualitative data points that we look at and we make inferences from. Sometimes we're correct, sometimes we're incorrect. Things like aha moments, either from ourselves or from our students, that we just see that we think that they're getting something, and we take that data, and a lot of times we feed on that data, and we can either act on it or not. Sometimes just random student comments that they might say in a classroom or in an email or during office hours or something. Sometimes we take that. As we know, these are difficult data points to generalize, to spread to a wider audience. It may just be that person, or it may be some of their background. So this is data, but sometimes it's a little bit biased. I think I've mentioned several times, I want to make sure I mention again that there's the infamous student evaluations of teaching that we get pretty much around the world. We ask students what they thought of the teaching. They evaluate us, and I always caution people that really they probably aren't evaluating, they're perceiving, which we value highly. But there's been plenty of data that shows that there's zero correlation between student evaluations of teaching and effective teaching. So I want to make sure people know that that data point is one of the few out there that have been empirically shown not to be connected. I'm not saying it's not helpful, and it might be worthwhile. It might provide some insights to us, but there is no correlation. We might look at their participation, their engagement, whether students are looking and viewing and answering questions, all of these things. Maybe it just feels right. Or some people say, well, the grades, if I get my students and they all get A's and B's, maybe that's an indicator of teaching effectiveness. I'm here to share maybe some news that we may not like or appreciate, or we may not even agree with it. But all of those data points, although they sound kind of nice, they really are empirical. They're subjective, they're spotty, they're random. They're really difficult to systemize, to take that data and to make clear indications and pathways on what we might do next. The only real way to do it is the last one that I have in bold yellow, is to gather some empirical data. So I think that's what this session's all about. People hopefully already are thinking, like, what does he mean by that? So we're going to unpack that over the next 30 or 40 minutes, and so that you can see what that means to you specifically. And I'm really hoping that as I go through this, you start to think about things that are important to you, that you might be able to do, that might take the right amount of time. I'm going to try to share strategies that take a little time, all the way up to things that take a lot of time. And I just want to remind us of, there's no secret to this. Things that we tend to spend a lot of time on tend to be better, more thorough, more complete, and things that we spend a little bit of time on tend to be less complete. Doesn't mean that they can't be helpful, and we all have to make that decision on how we spend our time. But I'll share with some of these things, and you may want to start to think about them now and kind of extend upon them each month as you teach. And the one major thing I want to say is if you'd like assistance with any of this one-on-one, I'm happy to help. This is what I do a lot of. So first of all, I want to make sure that you see some of the research on this. There's actually been a lot of research on this particular genre, this approach to looking at our teaching as research. There's 3 different terminologies that you may hear. Ernest Boyer came out in 1999 with this book called Scholarship Reconsidered, and he called it the scholarship of teaching and learning. So you may see this acronym occasionally of SOTL or SOTL, S-O-T-L, and you'll see the graphic there on the side. He basically redefined this concept of research. Historically, we thought of research as discovering things, right? Penicillin or some sort of a medical advancement or some sort of just a completely new discovery. And that's certainly a viable research path. It happens primarily in many universities. But he also said there's other ways to view research. One was the scholarship of integration. So what does one discipline or academic area have to do with another? We're doing a lot of multidisciplinary work, and even the way our brain functions really aligns with this. He defined the scholarship of application. This is in experiential or in service learning, doing something that's applied out inside into the real world settings. And then finally, he did talk about the scholarship of teaching. And this was a mechanism where we take very similar approaches to our social science research and we apply it to our teaching in our classroom for many reasons. But the primary reason was simply to answer the first question that we asked was, is what I'm doing working? are my teaching methods, are my assessment methods, are my engagement methods, online, blended, any of this stuff that I'm doing, how do I know that it's working? And how do I know if it actually is going to work tomorrow or the next time I teach it, or any other context that I might be in? So this is a formalized, kind of typically used in university settings, the scholarship of teaching and learning. I tend to use kind of a broader category, which I think makes a little more sense, and it's a little more simplified, the whole concept of teaching as research. I think everyone here, again, is either in a graduate program or has completed a graduate program. And so you are kind of technically researchers. You've been through a research program, which is really what graduate schools are all about. And so I encourage you to, kind of keep that research hat handy. And when you do start to plan to teach, or before you step in, or while you're inside the classroom or the virtual world teaching, think about teaching as a researcher, which means, coming up with hypotheses or research questions, or identifying variables, or try to figure out what happened and why it happened, causes and effects. And so the presentation today will be actually trying to help you kind of focus in on what that might be, and really help you with some next steps if you're interested in this. Now, the last term there, action research, this is actually a term that's used in many countries for K through 12 education. And so that basically is like, I'm going to do some research in action inside the classroom. Could be small type research questions, but I just want to lay these out because some of you may have seen these terms. These all basically mean very similar things, and they all mean how can we basically gather data to determine whether what our strategies and techniques and methods are working. So what is teaching as research? And so I always like to lay out the research on these. I really hope that you see a difference in my presentations and maybe some presentations that you've seen from others. Everything that I share has a parentheses and a person's name and a comma and a date. And again, as graduate students and graduates, this should be really familiar to you. I want to make it really clear that any information that I share is not information that I just dream up and I just wake up and say, oh, I think this is important, which sometimes happens. Again, I think as critical viewers and reviewers, I'm sure that you now look at information and presentations with a critical lens. And if somebody is trying to recommend something or tell you something, I hope that you're challenging them on that. And I hope that you're asking them the questions, where did you get that? And can you show me the evidence that works, and some citations on those? I mean, these are some pretty basic questions. And if they can't answer that, then I don't know. I tend to really kind of have some doubts about those methods. And so I just want to share that the background of this is pretty deep. Teaching as research, it's this investigation, and I'll share with you, it's actually systematic, intentional investigation of our teaching practice. That's what differentiates it from the aha moments, or they were smiling, or I had a lot of student questions. It really kind of works us into, what are we thinking about these questions before we deploy the treatment or the interaction, which would be the methodology. How do we collect that data and know that that data is collected in a reasonable, reliable, valid way? And then how are we going to analyze that to make some decisions so that we can use that data? It is publicly disseminated, which again, I'll share a lot of ways to do this. It can be in kind of peer-reviewed journals that you've been reading probably for your graduate courses, but don't get scared away with that, because it could literally be something that you collect and you share with a colleague, or you share within your department, right? That's still publicly disseminated. You're sharing it, and you're really kind of extending the value of what you've done in your classroom with others. That others could be very small, it could be very large. And the final thing is that it is built upon from and by others. And what that simply means is that you're reviewing the literature and you're determining what's out there, and you're adding to that. Maybe you're adding another step. Maybe you're building the same procedure, but it's in your context, and you're kind of trying to help the world, scholars, understand how widespread or the limitations that might be for that research. We call this standing on the shoulder of giants, right? So there actually have been some work that's been done out there. I encourage you to read and be aware of that, and think about how you might, as scholars, might be able to add to some of that. The one the thing that I see that happens occasionally is some faculty will say, some teachers might say, I've got a new method, and they'll share it with me, and I'll say, and I really appreciate their excitement, but I'll have to share with them, we've been doing that method for 10 or 20 years. So you might want to do a quick check first just to see what's out there. And I'm happy to provide. I have all types of research and meta-analysis and lists that I can share with you. Doesn't mean that we don't do it, but I think we need to make sure that we do our due diligence to know what has been out there and what's been done. So what's the point of this? Why would we do this in the first place? What's it going to do for us, our students, our profession? Well, it does use this kind of discovery reflection. There's a lot of research on metacognition and reflection and how we do these. But I can't emphasize enough from the very first second slide where I talked about empirical data, evidence-based research. This is the key. And again, I like having this conversation with graduate students and graduates of graduate programs, because you have to be thinking in this manner right now, whereas maybe before this, our undergraduate students we're hoping to encourage them to think about evidence, but really it comes down to this evidence base. And not just I have some evidence, but we need to be thinking about, like, what is the credibility of that evidence and how valid and reliable is it? And we've got some mechanisms to determine that. Findings are typically peer reviewed, and as I mentioned, publicly disseminated, but that peer review could be in a small group. It doesn't have to be worldwide. And if anyone is interested in this group, I'd be happy to develop kind of an internal peer review amongst all of us now or throughout the next year, and just to open up some communications so that we can share some of the work that we're doing, and somebody else take another look at that and give us a review and a critique of what you're doing. And of course, it's going to benefit a lot of people. Right? It definitely benefits the students. It benefits you. It's going to benefit anyone who really cares about these effective practices, because it turns it from an idea into these are really solid, rigorous, translatable, transferable methodologies that we can share with others. How's it going to be useful? Well, it can be useful in this quantifiable, rigorous research. Again, it's really taken this from an idea down to something. And again, don't let that scare you, the quantifiable, rigorous. All that means is that there's going to be mechanisms in place that helps us defend our decisions. So somebody says, where'd you get that data? How do you know that it's good data? Why did you do this? What were your results? You'll be able to share with them, well, here's this, there's the system. Here's the steps that I took to make sure of that. The biggest thing, and why I like this one, and I've got it in red, is that this is the biggest outcome for me. Some people say, oh, well, I'll be famous and I can publish a paper, and maybe that's never really my point. My point is to improve teaching. I think that's your goal. I think that's why you're on this session, is because you want to try to think about improving your teaching. And there's been plenty of research that indicates that just simply thinking about your teaching as research makes your teaching better. If you do nothing else except just think about teaching in a way that you ask yourself, why did it work? Could it work better? How could I make it work better? What do I have to do to make it work better? How can I feel confident that this is the best way to teach this concept? That alone, if that's all you do, it'll make your teaching more effective. So to me, that's the biggest win of all this. I mean, if I had to summarize this session in one statement, it would be that right there. So it's more of a philosophy, more of a perspective of how you're viewing teaching. Some people view teaching in a traditional way of, I'm going to walk in and tell somebody something. And we know the research that when you tell somebody something, it really does very little. Students don't incorporate it, they don't process it, they don't integrate it. They just they might get it right on a test, but it's not available to them long term, so they can use those things. But if we start to think about this teaching as research, we very quickly understand that we need to do something that's more sustainable. So again, I feel like everything else that I'm going to say after this is going to be supplemental to that one key concept. And then obviously the whole point of doing this is that you do have some evidence. Evidence of things that work. I'm sure that chances are you talk to your supervisor or your colleagues, or at the end of the year you have some sort of an annual performance, or you have to hand in something that indicates what you did for the year. And it probably has lesson plans and syllabi and so forth. This is a really nice extra piece to show that you not only had the plans and the strategies, but you collected some data on this, and here's your evidence to show that things are or are not effective. And I do want to caution us that collecting evidence isn't biased. We're not trying to collect evidence to prove what we're doing is correct. We're trying to collect evidence, period. It may actually show or may indicate there's some weaknesses in our methodologies, and that's not a negative. It's still a positive, because if we didn't collect the evidence, we wouldn't know if things are working or not. And so don't be ashamed, don't be embarrassed if your data shows that maybe what you're doing isn't as good as it should be. That's a huge positive, because now you know exactly what to focus in on to improve upon it, and then collect some more data. And that's the best way to kind of approach this, is in a storyline. So I almost would prefer that especially early career faculty start by collecting some data, and it shows that things aren't as good as they should be, because that gives you a lot of room to grow. During those growths and those modifications, we learn a tremendous amount about teaching, ourselves, our students, the interactions. And so in a perfect world, I would kind of hope that things don't go well for you when you start collecting this evidence. I know that sounds a little bit mean, but that way I know that there's going to be plenty of growth, and through that process, you're going to learn a whole lot about the teaching. All right. And this is usually when people start to say, okay, I understand, I hear you, and I understand the words you're saying, but let's be a little more specifics. What are some of those types? You know, what are some teaching as research types? And here I can imagine that during your graduate program, there might be some of these topics, especially if you took a research methods course. Some of these are going to actually resonate with you. The most common type, this is kind of done for the most part, is what's called a pre-post assessment. And all that means is that you're going to collect some data from your students before you provide the interaction, the treatment, the method, the lesson. You're going to collect, you know, what do they know ahead of time? And then you're going to teach something. And that could be, again, a concept. It could be a day, a week, a month. It could be a chapter, whatever that might be. And then you're going to collect a post assessment. And you're going to compare those two. And we call that the change or the delta. And the delta between those two, ideally, before you teach it, they probably don't really know very much, I'm assuming. If they do, then you may want to shift, you know, how you're going to teach that. And then after you teach it, there should be some sort of a gain. And that's really going to be what we're trying to measure as evidence. Now, we all know that that's really simple. And in real life, there's lots and lots of variables and things that go on. And so that's really the point, is trying to figure out what was my method? What am I comparing that to? Did I teach this in a different way and I saw a bigger gain or a different gain? Can I compare it to my colleagues who are teaching it in a certain way? Can I compare it to the literature that they indicate this concept is typically taught in this way, but I'm doing a modification on it? So did that modification really help my students out more or less? And I do want to get away from the more or less, because chances are it's going to simply be in a different way. And that's where it's going to become key that we have to really think about our research questions, because we know that teaching is not that simple of good or bad. There's all types of nuances and things that we want out of it. And so that's got to be really key up front. So the pre-post is kind of a fairly straightforward way. And even the pre-post can be subdivided into what's called quantitative or qualitative. So a quantitative would literally be, you know, a multiple choice test that you give at the beginning. And again, remember, the pre and post have to be that exact same test or assessment instrument. So you may do that, and they may score on average 2 out of 100. And then you may do the method and they score 80 out of 100, and there's some sort of a gain. Now, some people will say, well, that's obvious, Jace. Why do I need to collect data on that? And I would challenge that it may or may not be obvious. It depends on what you're comparing it to and what your research questions are. And really, if you're trying to examine and identify the key aspects of the method of how you taught that. The qualitative is another portion, kind of the other side of that coin. This is where you're going to try to get into more descriptive data. So instead of doing a pre and post on a quantitative test, you may do more qualitative. For example, one concrete example that I've done occasionally is that I'll have my students create a concept map of a particular concept before we even cover it. And so typically on the wall, they'll take Post-it notes and they'll map those out. And as you might imagine, before the concept, their map is pretty small. They have a few words, they have very little connecting terms. So that map looks like a skeleton, right? It really isn't very, very full. And then we teach, and then we do the exact same activity. And you can imagine that those maps are much larger and much more rich. And then I do a qualitative analysis, not just looking at the terms, but to me, the connections between the terms, because those are really key at what I'm looking at. And are they able to articulate and use the vocabulary? And did they make the kind of connections for me, this is where I'm able to identify a lot of misconceptions that may have taken place. So those are two basic, really super basic ways. I'm sure that hopefully you're thinking about some ways that you might do this. Some other types are, integration within some sort of a larger curriculum. What we teach is part of their degrees, part of students' programs. So you may think about how you could actually make that happen. Key issues, which right now some of the key issues is blended learning, hybrid learning, high flex learning, online learning. How did we do all this stuff in the past few months? So these are typically going to be timely and contextual. Comparisons of one course to another, one group of students to another, a course that you're teaching now with the same course that you taught last year. So having that really set up so that you can make those comparisons is going to be, could be interesting. And then it could just be a meta-analysis. And what this is, and I mentioned people looking at the previous literature reviews, we appreciate this, people that take a lot of analysis, a dozen or 20 papers and really kind of summarize those. If you're interested in that, that could be really a healthy, interesting way to get to know a particular concept before you start to think about using that as a method. And then people start to, when I work with faculty on some of these ideas and TaR, then they get to this question, like, give me some examples. Like, what do you mean what are things that I could pursue with my projects? And these are just a list of ideas to get you to start to think about these. And I'm sure that you read some of these and you're thinking, oh yeah, I do this and I do this. And yeah, I've always wondered about this. And for instance, rubrics, you've got one and you probably use it. Well, how do you know whether it's really being effective? Or various assessments. Are you doing formative or summative? And for the formative, are they graded or ungraded? And why would they be graded or ungraded? And how do you know whether they're being effective at scaffolding up your concepts into where you want them to be? These are all questions that I guarantee that you're asking yourselves. So I would really recommend, don't tackle all the questions, but find a couple questions and really pursue those deeply each month or each semester as you teach. I have to say that the third one there on motivation is becoming really key for students who are online, who are trying to learn online or trying to navigate through some of the, the online courses and programs and softwares. And so that's really a deep idea now that we're trying to think about. I actually began working on motivation of student learning online about 22, 24 years ago with my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation on self-regulated learning. And there's a lot still really needs to be uncovered about that. Not just because that it exists and we're doing it more, but because as you imagine, time and students and tools have been changing quite rapidly. So this is not just let me do it once and get an answer. This is going to be a moving target throughout history, and we need to continue to update that literature base. And then one of the final things is, I kind of touched upon this, but what would you do with some of these ideas? It really could be as simple as sitting down and on a piece of paper, on a napkin, on the back of your hand, just thinking about some strategies or ideas. So don't let this scare you away from starting it. I really encourage that you just start pondering some different ideas that you may want to use. It could turn into what's called a white paper, which is really something like the beginning of just your ideas and your thinking about how you might make some of these connections. You could actually think about sharing this at a teaching conference, which could be local, it could be online. If you have any thoughts about this, let me know. I'm happy to share with you a huge list of these that you may want to share this with. It could be a peer-reviewed teaching conference, which is just a little more rigorous, and that would come out with some proceedings that would allow you to kind of share with others. And then if you really are interested, and again, I'm happy to help with all these logistics, is to collect the data, write a paper, and submit it for peer review and publication into a journal. I know at times if you're early in your career or early in thinking about this, you may be thinking, I can't do that. Well, I want to be the first one to tell you that, yes, you can. And you're really the key people who should be doing these, is people who are teaching, because you're the ones that really know and are doing the on the ground kind of work. So whether you want to do it or not, that's up to you. But can you do it? I'm here to say absolutely. You can do it. You have the background to do it. And so that door is wide open if you want to do it. That's up to you. And also to think about the kind of the reward and recognition system, if that's going to be valuable to you. So let's take a moment. I'm going to pause here and step out and look at the chat to see some of the questions that have been asked there. But also I'd like you to, in the chat section, if you can just try to write down some ideas, anything at all, one word to a sentence of ideas that have been in your mind, or maybe that have just come up to your mind in the past few minutes, that you might be interested in finding out some research on this, of how you might, things that you might pursue in the next day, week, month, year on teaching research. So just write some of those ideas. They don't have to be fully fleshed out. They don't have to be hypotheses. They're research questions, but jot a few of those down inside the chat box. That's going to help me kind of see where you're coming from. And while you do that, I'm going to just review the 21 chats in our box to see if there's anything there that I can answer now. Excellent, excellent, great. Thank you all. These are great ideas. And as a reminder, in case people wonder where the chat goes to, I copy that and I paste that inside of our shared Google Doc. So I like to capture that. Yes, teaching is definitely a science, a social science. Excellent, I love that. Oh, good, good, good. Thank you for following up on the teaching, standing on the shoulder of giants. Excellent, excellent, excellent. All right. All right, so if you will, I'm going to go continue through some of this. Good, we're about halfway through, which is exactly where I wanted to be, because that's the first part of teaching as research, kind of like the overview. Now I'm going to get into some of the details. And as I do this, please go ahead and at any point share some of the ideas that you have on the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on that as we walk through these. So for those that are interested, I want to try to share the next steps. And these are the kind of the experimental approaches. And I'm hoping that these are some ideas that have already crossed your mind. And I can't imagine that going through your graduate programs that there will be portions of these. Chances are, though, that you probably didn't take this direction with these. So maybe this will be helping you think differently. The first thing is we have to come up with a research question. And that's why I just followed it with these ideas in the chat box. Once you take the ideas that I start seeing here coming up with things that you might want to pursue in your teaching, the next step would be to really kind of somewhat formalize those into a hypothesis or a problem statement or a research question. Call it what you want to. It could just be a question or a pondering, but you need to set that up so that it really is something that you're interested in, and that you can start to follow that, because that'll be the kind of the bench post that you're going to kind of stay connected to as you start to do the rest of these items. Obviously, it should be authentic. And what that really means is, hopefully it's something that has happened to you or is happening to you. It's going on in your classroom. Not only will it mean more to you, but you're going to find that you do a better job at it, and you'll be probably doing something that not everybody can do. Is it feasible? That obviously means, do you have the ability to collect this data, the timeline, the students, so forth, worthwhile? You're only going to know if it's worthwhile as if you go out and look at the literature and see if something like that's been done. The same with being original. And if you have found the same idea, that shouldn't prevent you from doing this. You can certainly do it. Just think about how you might do it in a different context so that you can add and contribute to the literature. But most of all, it's got to be important to you and your students, right? So this should be something that you're really thinking about, and it's been kind of maybe bugging you every time you teach or every time you have a conversation. You're like, well, why aren't they doing better with this? Or why aren't these outcomes happening? Those would be really key, and that should rise to the top of the list of how you might think about this. Once you have the question, probably becomes one of the more difficult parts, which is how are you going to design something that is rigorous and systematic. And so there's 4 basic designs. And again, I never quite know where people are at. Chances are you've seen this, but you may not have thought about it in the context of teaching. So the 4 is basically, the first one is the highest and the most rigorous, which is called an experimental design, which is where you actually randomly assign these participants into different treatments. This is going to be really, really difficult to do in a teaching as research because we don't have a clinical setting. We have our students, we have them there. We want to make sure we serve them all the time. There's even what's called the true 4-part Solomon design, which is the holy grail of all research designs. But I'll encourage you to not think about it in that way, because there's a time and a place for these really intensive experimental designs. Teaching as research is not one of those. Probably what you're going to be looking at is what's called a quasi-experimental design. Quasi means kind of a pseudo or a false or a fake or a semi. So it's close to an experimental design. The biggest difference is that you're not randomly assigning. And I do hope that you ran across this concept of random assignment. They say, what's the most powerful force in the universe? And some economists say that it's compound interest. Social scientists would say random assignments. Anytime that you can randomly assign, you're going to increase the power of your abilities to generalize, and to basically whatever findings that you have, you're going to be able to say, well, these findings would generalize or transfer to other settings. So although it's really, really nice and important, I think what's key here with teaching as research is you want to really focus in on your class first. And then hopefully a literature review kind of emerges and everybody's doing these, and somebody can kind of connect all those pieces together and figure out whether that method's going to work for them. You could also just do a correlational design. So you're looking at two things, which could be, gender and active learning. It could be online and experience. It could be technology experience and online. It could be age. It could be, you're looking at these two things and seeing what the effect is between these two. That might be something of interest. If you don't have a large group, or you'd like to really drill deeply, you may think about what's called a case study. And I do want to caution, this is, the term case study is thrown around a lot. And most of the time, if you see the term case studies, they're not case studies. They're stories. They're interesting, but they're not case studies. A case study is that. It is an experimental design. It is a study that has a mechanism, it has valid instruments, it has interpretations. If somebody just says, hey, I wrote this blog on this thing that I did in my class and it seemed like it worked well, that's not a case study. That's a story. It's nice, it's interesting. It might be a good start to a case study. It might be something that was a preface that allowed us to think, well, this is interesting enough to collect data on a case study. But as educated scholars, I hope that you're going to help us all really help people understand that these words mean something. So when someone says a case study, let's make sure that it actually is a case study. And if not, then they should call it what it is, which is a story. All right, so hopefully you're thinking of those four. You're probably kind of narrowing it down to the last three bullets there, and which ones of those that you might think about as your design for your particular teaching as research. Now we have to think about how we're going to collect data. And the data, again, sometimes as a chemist, I think of data as a certain way. I think a lot of people think of data as numbers, 4.67, and that can be data. But there's also other data. There's qualitative data, which could be, words and terms and descriptions and testimonials and student thoughts. And there's a lot of ways to think about data. But we tend to think of data in two major categories, direct and indirect. Direct measures are how we're actually going to look directly at a performance or an outcome or something that we can measure directly. So something like what students produce, our observations of students. And again, these are going to have some sort of clear measurement rubric, and that rubric is going to be validated, calibrated, reliable. We talked a bit about that at the last session. Another way is indirect. And indirect measures are surveys and focus groups, and I highly caution people in this. Sometimes we use the term that indirect measures are necessary but not sufficient. So if you're going to collect data and you're only going to collect indirect measures, and if you remember that one of the first slides I shown about student surveys and teaching evaluations, this is why those are so insufficient, because they're highly biased. They really don't tell us a lot. They kind of tell us a lot about feelings and emotions, but not really about how people can behave. And so I would highly recommend that you, at a minimum, try to include both, one direct, one indirect. If you can triangulate and collect, 3 pieces of data, you're going to just really increase your chances of those findings being rigorous and more generalizable. Great. Let's see. Excellent, excellent, love it. Thanks for all the comments on the chat. So then you want to think about, even at this point, you want to think about where this is going to go. Is it going to be a white paper? Is it going to be to your colleagues? Because that's going to determine your writing approach, you know, what you do with your instruments. Somebody mentioned that it may be their research proposal. That's another one that you may want to think about, and think about if it's going to go out into the literature. You know, look at that journal, or look at the white paper, or look at the blog, or wherever it's going to be. Think about that ahead of time, so that you actually are making sure that you're aligning all your work, the way that you phrase it, the way that you're building upon the previous studies. But the bottom line is that anything you do should be grounded in some sort of a theoretical framework. And I'm sure that you've gone through this in your graduate programs. This is also a really quick and easy way to differentiate between your work and some people that are writing just kind of blogs and ideas. And I'm not against these magazines. They're fine to read as kind of enjoyable fun, but I always caution people before they think about getting serious about implementing any of these things that anybody is writing on the web. You know, think about the ones that actually have some sort of citations and some scholarly rigor to them. And kind of briefly, I'll go through a few of these things, and thinking about, we want to make sure that we have an introduction and the methods. A few key points here is, whenever you are writing, you have to realize that your reader needs to be brought into that context concisely and enough so that they can understand the data that you're going to share with them later. Always try to remember that for the most part, you're going to have, in social science, have a double-blind review. That means that the reviewer won't know you and you won't know the reviewer. This keeps a hyper focus in on quality, and it kind of what we call levels the playing field for everybody. You don't have to be at a Harvard, a Stanford to publish. You just have to have good ideas and good methods and good kind of rigorous approaches to some of these things. Try to make sure that everything is in super detail. As a chemist, I'm kind of used to doing this. You want to think about the whole point of doing the methods is try so that somebody else can repeat this in your absence. And so if somebody reads your paper and they love your method, you want to make sure that you have every single step in there, so that if they were to happen to miss one, then they wouldn't be able to come up with the same conclusions. And this is something that you might actually start to document while you're doing the methods, because it's easy to forget those when you start to write. And then obviously the results section, this is all your tables, your graphs. Sometimes a lot of the things we do have some word count limits, and so you may want to think about putting some of those in your Google Docs and linking to those so that you can keep your word count to a certain amount. The biggest challenge and the mistake that early career teachers tend to make in the results is they want to talk about the results or post the results and then interpret them. We have to be really compartmentalized. Only the results go in the results. Interpretations will be in the discussion and the conclusion. And so chances are you'll write, and you'll just be eager to write interpretations. Have somebody review your paper first, and they'll probably recommend that you move those and incorporate those inside of your discussions. And most of the time in social science research, we do use what's called APA, which is the American Psychological Association guidelines. I'll be quite honest, these are pretty rigorous. I'm happy to kind of share and teach and give you some ideas on where you might find these guidelines. It's like anything else. Once you get used to doing these, you'll be able to pick those out. But this frequently is why a lot of papers and conference proceedings get rejected, because people haven't really built their APA guidelines to format. And then finally, you want to start to talk about what happened, right? So you summarize these. This is more of an art than a science, because you need to figure out what it is that reader wants to know and interpret these findings. Many times people think that a negative finding is not worth writing about, or finding something that doesn't have a statistical significance isn't really important, when that's not the case. It can be just as important if something didn't happen that you expected to happen, or your null hypotheses, your research question didn't come true. That could be just as important. So you want to share all of those. You definitely want to have a conversation with the audience, because what they're reading this to figure out whether they can use it. And so you want to try to give them some sticky points so they can infer and make some decisions on whether it might work within their school, their setting. And as I mentioned, even the ones that don't have these statistical significance, you may want to share clearly. The biggest section in my discussions is I always try to focus in on the variables. And I kind of live and die by these 3 steps. I always try to keep in mind and identify clearly what the variables were, and there will always be variables. I tackle this as more of a game or a puzzle, And I kind of play with this, like, what are all those variables? You know, did I teach this at the same time? Is it at the same group of students? What were their backgrounds? Is it the same weather outside? Was there some major event like a pandemic that occurred? These are all variables that take place. Their variables aren't good or bad, they just exist. We need to make sure that we do a really good job at identifying these. And then we do what we can. We try to minimize these. If we can take away or minimize the variables, it's going to allow those comparisons to be a little more accurate, a little more generalizable. But the bottom line is, if you can't minimize, which we can't, eliminate all variables, is then we just have to make sure that in the discussion section, we're accounting for these. We're being very clear with the reader. I know about these. I didn't overlook these. You don't have to remind me about these. I know they existed. And here's what I did to kind of account for these. If you can account for those or minimize those in your setting, I recommend you do those. If you can't, then I still recommend that you run this procedure, because it may tell you some really interesting things. But those are the three things, the variables that really are going to be, I think, important to the reader for them to decide whether they can or would get much out of duplicating your approach. And then you want to identify some further work for the reader, but also for yourself. I think that this could be ongoing. Every time I do a project, it gives, I have one question that after I'm done with it, I end up having 4 or 5 more questions. And it literally becomes almost a lifetime of questions. And obviously you want some references. I can't imagine that you haven't gone through this in your graduate program with the formats, double checking these. You want recent research. One of the biggest things I've reviewed for probably 10 different journals is I see a lot of people that are citing older research. And it's funny how older doesn't seem old, but 1990, 2000, I mean, it should be hopefully within the last 10 years. If you're talking about educational technology, it should be in the last 5 years. Obviously, you want to cite some foundational things, especially if you're talking about your theoretical frameworks, citing Bandura, Piaget, Dewey, those are fine, but that shouldn't be the extent of your literature review. And then if you are going to use some websites, and there is AP Edition 6 that shows how you cite these, that's changed quite a bit. So take a look at that and make sure that you're citing those reputable websites. Logistically, this is something that I always remind people of. Sometimes people early on, they think that they just submit something and wait a couple days and then somebody sends back this accepting, and that's not the way it works. You have to really submit it, confirm it, track it, follow up on it, or remind them. The best outcome is typically accepted with major revisions. You have to jump on those revisions early and right away. There's actually, after you write it, there's just as much work that you have to do afterwards to make sure that you really follow up and have a conversation and make sure that it gets published. And again, I'm happy to help with these. I've been super lucky the past couple of decades. I have over 150 publications, so I've done this a few times, and I can help you avoid some of the common mistakes if you're interested in taking this path. Just want to remind folks, I'm happy to have these kind of conversations, but I am happy to follow up. I can certainly assist with this to give you some examples, some research questions, check your instruments, provide some resources and references for your lit review. You may want to use me or some of your colleagues as sounding boards just to run some ideas by, double check your design, your measures, and the formats. All these are things that are going to be helpful. Regardless, even if it's a simple paper or white paper internal, don't think of any of this as too small. Feel free to share it with me or others. It can be really fun and enjoyable, but through that, I think that you're going to see that, back to slide number 2, you're going to collect some data that is really going to be dependable and allow you to take the next steps. So I'm hoping that after that second part, there may be some other things that are pondering and kicking around in your mind. Feel free to add some of those to the chat box, or feel free to add them to our shared Google Doc now or later as they come up. But I want to make sure that that's, yep. So that's kind of wrapping up phase 1 and phase 2. I know there was a tremendous amount of information there. Hopefully you've seen portions of those through your graduate programs, and maybe now you're trying to kind of translate those into what that might look like in your classroom, day to day, and more on an ongoing. Sometimes we really forget that the graduate work that we do is for usually a major research project or a thesis or a dissertation, which is great. But I'm hoping that people can find ways to dissect that out and pull portions of it out to incorporate into their daily lives in various ways that really make sense to us. So that's what I have for today. We have just a few minutes left, about 5 minutes left. I am going to stop sharing and stop the recording, and then I will take some questions.